The doormat. My name is Madeline Carter. I'm 33, I live in Evanston, Illinois, and I work as a marketing director for a tech company. For as long as I can remember, I've been the daughter who stayed quiet, the one who planned every holiday, mopped up every spill, and gave while my brother and sister collected the praise. On Christmas night, I thought I was just keeping tradition alive, making sure my father's dinner looked perfect. But with 25 relatives watching and glasses clinking around the table, he laughed and called me the family doormat. In that single moment, years of being overlooked rose to the surface, and for the first time in my life, I didn't swallow it. I stood up, I spoke, and what happened next turned our family upside down in ways no one expected. Stay with me, you'll want to see how far the truth can travel once it finally breaks free. Snow drifted down in lazy flakes outside the wide windows of my parents' house, soft against the glow of the street lamps. Inside, firelight and the twinkle of the Christmas tree made everything look like the cover of a holiday card. The dining tables stretched nearly wall to wall, set with the china my mother only brought out once a year. Relatives shook snow from their boots and filled the house with noise, cousins hugging, laughter rolling through the rooms, the smell of roasted turkey mixing with pine. To anyone walking in, it looked like the perfect Christmas evening. To me, it was just another night where I'd do most of the work and get noticed the least. I moved constantly, straightening candles, adjusting the centerpiece, slipping into the kitchen to stir the gravy. No one saw me doing any of it, but if I'd vanished for 5 minutes, everyone would have noticed something was missing. That was my role, the invisible hand holding the whole evening together. My father stood by the front door greeting guests like he'd orchestrated the entire thing himself, shaking hands, clapping backs, beaming as people complimented the decorations as if the house had dressed itself. Not one word about the daughter who'd spent days getting every detail right. Rebecca arrived with Emma and Luke in matching red sweaters, and the room burst into applause over how adorable they looked. I knelt down to help Luke out of his snow boots before he tore off across the carpet, but Rebecca barely glanced my way. She was already telling our mother about some research award she'd won at the hospital. Gregory came in right behind her, loud and confident, holding a single bottle of wine like it was a trophy. My father's whole face lit up. He pulled Gregory into a hug like a soldier home from war, proud to show off his son the lawyer. I slipped past both of them into the kitchen to pull the rolls out before they burned. By the time everyone sat down, there were close to 25 people crowded around that table. The kids had their own smaller table nearby, already giggling over candy canes. Uncle Frank had staked out a spot near the bar cart, red-faced and cheerful. Thomas Green, my father's old friend who owned a restaurant downtown, sat across from him, raised his glass, and said our family always knew how to put together a beautiful table. My father chuckled and said modestly that it was all teamwork. I stared at my plate. Teamwork meant me doing the carrying while everyone else did the enjoying. Platters circled the table, voices rose, and every time I tried to actually eat something, someone needed the bread basket refilled or more butter passed down. I jumped up to carve turkey for the kids. My father nodded approvingly like he was pleased with how well I served. When Emma spilled her juice, I was already there with napkins, sliding plates out of the way before the tablecloth could stain. A few guests laughed and called me quick. My father grinned and said every family needed someone dependable. It was meant as a compliment. It cut deeper than anything else he could have said. Dependable was all I had ever been to any of them. David sat further down the table with my cousins, quiet, polite, clearly noticing everything. When our eyes met, his expression said he understood. Later, as I passed behind him with a tray of coffee cups, he murmured that I deserved to sit down and actually enjoy myself. I gave him a faint smile, touched, but I knew that if I stopped moving, no one else would step in. It was easier to keep working than to fight what they all expected of me. As dinner went on, the conversation drifted predictably toward everyone's accomplishments for the year. Gregory told a long story about his firm winning some high-profile case, and the table leaned in, nodding, clapping him on the back. My father raised his glass and called him destined for partnership. Then Rebecca described a rare diagnosis she'd caught at the hospital, and the table gasped in admiration. My mother squeezed her hand, eyes glistening with pride. My chest ached, listening to all that admiration pour over the two of them. When someone finally asked about me, my father waved a hand and said I'd helped get the evening ready. The conversation moved on instantly, and I went invisible again. I'd baked the pies myself the night before and carried them over carefully. When dessert came out, my mother walked in with the pecan pie and accepted compliments on her baking, promising to send my aunt the recipe. I stood beside her slicing it, staying quiet. She'd bought the cookies that morning from the bakery, cookies I'd arranged on the plate, and was praised for those too. I carried the dirty dishes into the kitchen and ran the hot water over them, listening to the laughter still going behind me. My hands trembled under the faucet. It felt like washing away some small piece of myself that no one had ever noticed in the first place. Then came the gifts. Wrapping paper flew everywhere. Emma squealed over a dollhouse, Luke hugged a toy truck to his chest. My parents handed Gregory a sleek leather briefcase, and the room applauded how perfect it was for him. Rebecca opened a pair of diamond earrings, and my mother cried while fastening them into her ears. When it was my turn, my father slid an envelope across the table, a gift card to a department store. He patted my shoulder and told me to buy myself something nice. I smiled, thanked him, and tucked it into my pocket. The difference between what I'd gotten and what my siblings had gotten was obvious to anyone paying attention. No one was paying attention, they clapped and moved on. By the time music started playing softly and everyone leaned back full in content, my whole body ached from hours of standing. My hands smelled like dish soap, my feet throbbed. And I was still the one clearing glasses and topping off wine. I paused at the window for a moment. Snow drifted down outside, blanketing the street, and the houses across the road glowed warm with families gathered inside them. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, trying to ground myself in this bright, noisy house where I'd never felt more alone. When I turned back, my father was already on his feet again, glass raised, about to speak. The guests hushed. Gregory leaned back in his chair. Rebecca touched her new earrings. My mother folded her hands. I slid back into my seat in the corner, hands in my lap, smile fixed in place. Something inside me rumbled, low and quiet. The night wasn't over yet. My father's voice rolled easily over the room as he launched into another story about Gregory's brilliance at the firm. Everyone leaned toward him, eyes shining, while my mind drifted somewhere else entirely, back to other nights, other tables, when the spotlight had never once swung my way. I thought about the spring of 2010, the day I graduated high school. I'd worked harder than anyone in my class, delivered the valedictorian speech, walked across that stage with honors, and when I looked out into the audience, the seats where my parents were supposed to be sat empty. They were hundreds of miles away, driving Gregory to an interview at Columbia Law. I told myself it made sense, that his future mattered, but the hollow feeling of standing up there alone never really left me. 2 years later, on my 21st birthday, I'd planned a small celebration at a restaurant downtown, paid for it myself, proud that I'd saved up enough. That afternoon, my mother called to cancel. Rebecca had just been accepted into Northwestern's medical program, and the family wanted to celebrate her instead. I told my friends something had come up and blew out a cupcake alone at home while I could hear my neighbors laughing through the wall. When I finally got my marketing degree from the University of Illinois in 2014, I thought, just for a second, that maybe this time they'd really see me. I crossed the stage again, diploma in hand, found my parents afterward, and they asked about Gregory's bar exam and Rebecca's summer research. My degree barely registered, a footnote in someone else's story. In 2017, I bought my own house in Evanston, not grand, but mine, paid for with money I'd saved dollar by dollar. At the housewarming, I filled the rooms with balloons and finger food, proud of what I'd built on my own. My parents arrived, and within minutes were talking about Gregory's courtroom wins and Rebecca's residency. Guests left that night knowing everything about my siblings and almost nothing about the woman who'd hosted them. And then there was 2019, when Grandma Margaret got sick. I drove her to every appointment, picked up her prescriptions, sat with her on the nights she couldn't sleep. When she passed that winter, I handled the funeral, chose the flowers, wrote the obituary, greeted everyone at the service, while my parents wept quietly in the front row. Family friends praised Rebecca for managing to come home from the hospital just in time. I was invisible even in grief. All of it pressed down on me as I sat at that table in 2023, watching my father beam at Gregory. Even money had been part of the pattern. Back in 2018, Gregory had borrowed $3,500 from me for a car, promising to pay it back within the year. 5 years later, I was still waiting. Rebecca, meanwhile, called whenever her babysitter fell through, and I always rearranged my schedule to watch Emma and Luke. I loved those kids, but the way Rebecca talked about it made it sound like I owed her that time, simply because she was a doctor and I wasn't. My father's glass rose again, toasting to family, to success, to being proud of his children. His eyes barely touched me, and when they did, it was with that same familiar look, the one that said I was useful but never remarkable. I swallowed the bitterness down like stale wine. Across the table, David caught my eye and gave the faintest tilt of his head as if reminding me to breathe. My pulse slowed, but my hands stayed clenched in my lap. I heard my aunt whisper to my mother about how lucky she was to have such accomplished children. My mother nodded, eyes glassy, never once glancing my way. I pushed food around my plate and thought about every Thanksgiving I'd cooked alone while my father thanked my mother for hosting. Every Easter I'd stuffed candy into plastic eggs until midnight while Rebecca soaked up praise for her kids' happy faces. Years of this, stacked on top of each other like the dishes piling in the sink. And as my father got ready to make yet another toast, I had the strange feeling that tonight was building toward something heavier than usual. His voice carried easily over the room again as he launched into another retelling of Gregory's latest win in court. The table fell quiet, heads turning toward him like this story was the centerpiece of the night. Gregory leaned back, grin spreading, soaking it all in. I sipped my water and tried to ignore the way my father's words made me feel like a stranger at my own family's table. He went on about Gregory's sharp instincts, the multi-million-dollar settlement his firm had trusted him to help secure. A few cousins clapped politely. My aunt asked follow-up questions, clearly impressed. My father's chest swelled like he'd argued the case himself. I pressed my fork into the tablecloth just to give my hands something to do. When the applause died down, Rebecca picked up the thread, smooth, practiced, the same tone she probably used on worried parents in the pediatric ward. She told a story about a little boy she'd treated that fall, how she'd caught a rare condition early and spared him years of suffering. My mother's eyes welled up. She called her daughter a true angel. Rebecca smiled modestly and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, clearly used to this kind of attention. My father raised his glass again to his brilliant children, his lawyer, and his doctor, and said it twice, like he wanted to make absolutely sure everyone at the table understood that his children had made it, that they'd justified all those years of hard work. His eyes never landed on me. I was sitting 3 feet away and it felt like miles. When a cousin finally asked about me, my father gave a small shrug and said I'd helped with dinner, that I was always good at organizing things. Light. Dismissive, as if my entire existence could be summed up by a well-set table. The conversation moved on before I could even feel the sting properly. My cheeks burned, but no one noticed. I cut into a piece of cold turkey and thought about the campaigns I'd led that year at work. The long nights, the growth numbers, the praise from my manager after I landed a major client. I wanted to stand up and say I'm more than napkins and serving platters. Instead, I stayed quiet. Thomas Green leaned toward my parents and told them they must be so proud. My father said he was blessed. My mother smiled and avoided my eyes entirely. That silence, the gap where my name should have been, felt heavier than anything else said all night. David shifted in his seat, jaw tight, and gave me the faintest shake of his head, like he was telling me not to let it break me. I forced my mouth into a smile that felt brittle even to me. Emma tugged on Rebecca's sleeve, wanting more pie. Rebecca passed her plate down to me without a word, like I was the server, not her sister. I took it, cut a slice with practiced ease, and handed it back. Emma grinned and thanked me sweetly, which softened something in me for just a moment, but the sting of being treated like hired help lingered underneath it. The music shifted to a softer carol. I looked around at all the glowing faces leaning toward Gregory and Rebecca and thought, nothing is ever going to change if I stay silent. My father's words had been small, technically, but the impact landed sharp, invisible again, the same role I've played my entire life. I got up and carried a tray of dishes into the kitchen. The sink was already piled high, the window above it fogged with steam. I set the plates down harder than I meant to and gripped the counter with both hands. My reflection stared back at me, tired, drawn. I thought about every year I'd carried this, every excuse I'd made for them. My stomach twisted. Behind me, my father was retelling some old story about Gregory winning a high school debate championship. Rebecca laughed, correcting some detail. No one had noticed I'd left. I wiped my hands, squared my shoulders, and went back. My seat sat exactly as I'd left it, untouched, like I'd never been there at all. I slid back in, folded my napkin, and looked around. My father's hand rested on Gregory's shoulder. My mother leaned toward Rebecca, listening intently. No one leaned toward me. I picked up my water and took a slow sip. My throat was dry, not from thirst, but from years of swallowed words. The chatter rose again, a wave I'd been treading my entire life. My father laughed at his own joke, and the table laughed with him. I smiled along, but inside, something pressed harder against my ribs, like a dam straining under pressure. I looked at the Christmas tree lights, glittering and bright, almost mocking from where I sat in the shadows. I knew somehow that I was approaching a point I wouldn't be able to step back from. My father's wine glass caught the light from the chandelier as he rose to speak one more time. His voice filled the room with that same booming confidence that had shaped every family gathering I could remember. He thanked everyone for coming, slipped into old stories, triumphs, lessons he believed he'd passed down, and the room leaned in, warm, hanging on every word. The story curved back to Gregory naturally. A courtroom win turned into legend, into a symbol of Carter pride. Laughter followed, the kind that cemented my brother permanently in the role of golden son. Then my father turned to Rebecca, recalling her tireless hours at the hospital, how families would never forget the angel who'd saved their kids. He raised his glass again and the room followed. The applause rang in my ears like a drumbeat aimed only at me. Then it happened. My father chuckled and said that every family needs someone to soak up the mess, someone who never complains, a doormat who keeps the house running. He laughed at his own line, clearly expecting the table to laugh along with him. A few relatives gave awkward chuckles, others forced smiles. For a moment I froze completely, my fork hung in midair. The word echoed through my head, drowning out everything else. Doormat. He'd said it like a nickname, like it summed up my entire existence in front of friends, family, and his business partner. My chest tightened, my ears buzzed. The air around me seemed to shift. Gregory gave a nervous laugh and muttered that maybe that was a little harsh. Rebecca stared at her plate, unwilling to say anything in my defense. My mother kept her eyes on her glass, pale and silent. The Christmas lights blurred into streaks of color. I clenched my hands under the table, willing myself not to cry. 33 years pressed against my ribs all at once, the empty graduation seats, the canceled birthday, the housewarming no one remembered, every holiday I'd planned without so much as a thank you, every dollar lent and never returned. All of it crowded into that single word, doormat. The laughter faded as people realized I hadn't joined in. My father was still grinning, waiting for the moment to pass, but my stillness was throwing off the whole room. I set my fork down slowly, pushed my napkin onto the table, stood up. The chair scraped against the hardwood loud enough that every head turned. I lifted my glass of champagne, and though my hand trembled, my voice came out clear. Stronger than I felt, I told him he was right, that I'd been the family doormat for 33 years. The words wiped the smile off his face instantly. He stared at me, unsure whether I was joining the joke or not. I didn't soften. I reminded him and everyone else at that table how many birthdays and holidays I'd organized, how many hours I'd spent cooking and cleaning and fixing things, how much money I'd poured into problems that were never mine to solve. I said it calmly, laying it all out in front of every guest in the room. My father tried to cut in, insisting it had only been a joke, that I was taking it too seriously. Gregory muttered that I was being too sensitive. Rebecca suggested I was probably just stressed from work. Every single response confirmed what I'd always known. They'd protect the family's image before they'd ever acknowledge what I'd been carrying. I raised my glass higher and told them that if I was a doormat, tonight was the last night anyone in that room would wipe their feet on me. Dead silence. Even the kids seemed to sense something had shifted. My mother's lips parted like she wanted to say something, but nothing came. The storm inside me finally broke, not with tears, but with clarity. I told them I wouldn't be planning the holidays anymore. Wouldn't be organizing birthdays. Wouldn't be loaning money that never came back or carrying burdens no one else wanted to touch. My voice didn't waver once. I set the glass down hard enough that the sound rang through the stillness. My father's face had gone red, embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. He sputtered something about gratitude, about everything the family had given me. I met his eyes and told him that a roof and food growing up was the bare minimum, not a debt requiring a lifetime of servitude. The words came easier with every sentence, each one freeing something a little more. Around the table, guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to stay or slip away. Thomas Green cleared his throat, muttered something about getting some air, and disappeared onto the porch. A few cousins followed. What was left was the core of the family, staring at each other in the wake of everything I'd just said. My heart was pounding, but for the first time in years, I felt the weight actually lifting. I wasn't invisible anymore. Every eye at that table was on me, not with love, not with admiration, but with recognition. They couldn't pretend anymore. They knew exactly what I'd been carrying. I stood there a moment longer, letting the silence stretch. Then I grabbed my purse off the back of my chair, looked once more at the decorations I'd hung, the food I'd made, the entire evening I'd built, and turned away, leaving them to sit with what had just happened. My father called my name behind me, sharp and demanding. I didn't stop. My heels clicked against the hardwood, each step deliberate, marking the start of something new. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee, the dishwasher humming uselessly while the actual sink overflowed with plates. I set my purse on the counter and pressed both hands flat against the cool marble, steadying myself. My pulse was still racing, but underneath it, for the first time in years, I felt calm. Behind me, muffled voices rose in the dining room, frantic whispers, a chair scraping, glasses being set down too quickly. I grabbed my coat off the hook by the back door, the wool soft and familiar under my hands, and slid the door open. Cold air rushed in. The yard outside was dark and still, fresh snow glistening under the porch light. My heels crunched against the frozen ground as I stepped onto the patio and breathed in deep, letting the cold cool the heat still rising in my chest. The door opened behind me. My father's voice cut through the quiet, sharper now, stripped of the charm he'd used at the table. He told me to come back inside, that I was embarrassing the family. I turned just enough to meet his eyes in the light spilling from the kitchen. His face was red, his jaw tight, shoulders squared like he could simply order me back to my seat. I told him I was finished. He sputtered, said everything I had was because of him, that children owed their parents respect, that family loyalty wasn't optional. I let the words bounce off me like sleet against glass. Respect, I told him, wasn't something owed, it was something earned. For years, I'd given him my silence, my time, my effort, and he'd given me the role of servant in return. That wasn't enough anymore. He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but I'd already turned away, pulling my coat tighter, walking toward the driveway. Behind me, I could hear Gregory's voice rising, trying to smooth things over with whatever guests remained. Rebecca murmuring something about me being overworked. My mother said nothing at all. That silence was louder than anything else. I brushed the snow off my windshield with my sleeve and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine groaned in the cold before catching.